Okay, welcome everyone to another VDEV CPR bread seminar. Today we're very happy to have Leopoldo Fergusson from Universidad de los Andes in Colombia presenting Accent as Capital. And we're lucky to have his co-authors Michael and Natalia here as well. They will be answering questions on the chat. As usual, Leopoldo will take the floor for 45 minutes. Attendants can make questions through the Q&A function of Zoom throughout, and I'll pick a few of them to pass them on live to Leopoldo. And at the end, we'll have 10-15 minutes for live questions. If you have any questions that deserve a longer discussion, just feel free to raise your virtual hand towards the end of the talk, and I'll just open up the microphone for you to ask it live to Leopoldo. From the Q&A, I'm just going to choose to pass just a few clarifying questions to Leopoldo through the talk, but rest assured that we'll pass him all the transcripts from the Q&A, so he'll receive your questions. Also, Leopoldo has kindly agreed to have a separate Zoom room open after the talk to discuss research with anyone who's interested, and Nico will paste the Zoom link on the chat later on. Okay, so without further ado, Leopoldo, the floor is yours for the next 45 minutes. Thank you very much for accepting our invitation.
Hello, everyone, and thank you very much to the organizers for having us present this paper. Thank you, Gianmarco, for moderating. As you noted, my great co-authors, Natalia Garbiras and Michael Weintraub, are also connected, so it's great that three of us have the chance to share this work with you. I would also like to thank our RAs, Hernán Carvajal and Jorge Luis Ochoa, who did like a magnificent job. And what I'm going to share with you today is the idea that class accents not only reflect the socioeconomic resources that we have, but they also help reproduce them. So let me just start by way of motivation by noting that our accent, the ways in which we pronounce a language, is really something powerful, very powerful signal of our background and the characteristics we possess. And that could be our national origin, it could be the region within a country, it could be our ethnic background, the generation to which we belong, it could be our gender. And what we'll focus on today is the socioeconomic group that we belong to. Now, it's been shown that accents lead to differential treatment very starkly and very early on. And to just give you one example, 5-year-olds prefer children who share their accent even over those who share the same race. So it seems that accent trumps race often. Moreover, class-based variation, which is what our focus, is very clear. William Labov's influential study went out to New York and checked the sound of the R in the expensive Saks department store and the non-expensive store Klein. And it showed the difference in these sounds. But moreover, it also showed that when you ask someone in Klein's, what was that? People would respond attempting the higher class R sound or making an effort to sound more upper class. So it is not only that there is variation in the sounds that we make, it's also that there is one that is considered more correct, more high status, more appropriate. Perhaps a starker case is the received pronunciation in the UK, the Queen's English, and in people in the UK, perhaps not surprisingly say, get the right accent and you'll get the right job. And precisely, this class-based variation is clear, is not only clear, but can also be consequential. And for instance, I'm citing here a meta-analysis that shows how higher status accents are typically much more hireable than lower status accents. So with this in mind, what is it that we do? So first we ask, let me just move this out of the way. Okay, this is better. First, we investigate whether class-based accents affect several dimensions, specifically interpersonal relations, labor market performance, and wide views about society. This is novel in some respects, particularly in the precise and careful design of our experiment. However, it has also been explored in the literature before. What is more novel is that we will ask whether they matter because they convey correlated differences in income and education, or because they have some sort of independent effect. Now, of course, that's super challenging, and the approach to overcome it is to devise an experiment to test class-based accents and to isolate the effects from income and education. Let me just preview our results. We will find that class accents matter. We will document a high class premium, that is, people prefer others who speak a higher class accent in these various domains that I referred to before. And we will show that this operates beyond as a simple signal of income and education. Moreover, even if individuals that have low socioeconomic status still prefer the higher class accent to the lower class accent, high status individuals have an even stronger preference for those higher class accents, which indicates an in-group bias that is consequential. An additional finding is that when we try to interpret these results, we will argue that these effects emerge because accents serve as reminders of these socioeconomic gaps and status that extend beyond income and education and that capture the cultural and social resources that you possess because you belong to a particular social class, and which are typically hard to change and can become a source of persistence in inequality. Finally, I'll show some evidence that class-based accent saliency also affects society's levels of trust. And it is from all of these put together that we argue that class-based accents are capital, are specifically sociocultural capital. And they are, in the sense that they are a durable asset that not only reflects the class and status differences between people, but they also help reproduce them. Good. So let me briefly outline the types of literature that we're contributing to. On the one hand, there is an extensive economic literature on barriers to equity and mobility across various dimensions. But I would say that, class and accent-based discrimination have been comparatively less studied in economics compared to other dimensions, in particular race and gender. And studying is quite important because it provides a mechanism consistent with several findings that are there in the literature, including both theoretical and empirical arguments for persistent inequalities, as well as ideas on how segregation and social connections can reinforce disparities. Of course, actually in this literature, there is the understanding that segregation and living in different cultures are part of what leads people to have different accents. And there is evidence that these disparities extend to social and cultural cues. And there's been some recent work, particularly in the context of academia, for instance, looking precisely at the effect of social class. And in our case, we're looking at a particular stark marker of that social class, which is, accents. Second, although this has not been that extensively studied by economists, a significant amount of work has been inspired by classical ideas in sociology. And sociologists have contributed with empirical evidence on the role of class and status in reproducing inequality. This has been done in labor markets, in education, in attitudes. And in relation to this literature, which in some cases actually studies high-class accents as the key variable, our contribution is that many of the designs in those papers do not actually attempt to separate the effects of accents from other crucial components of class that are very closely correlated with those accents. And we want to abandon the roles specifically of income and education. Our results are also relevant or also speak to in-group preference. They align with the literature on identity formation and group boundaries, and they demonstrate how accents can both, create and reinforce those boundaries. There's also, in a spin that I will refer to later, we also make a contribution to the literature on international migration and cultural assimilation, but let me explain that when we get to the results. The final thing that I would like to note is that methodologically, the way we embed our conjoint experiment in a survey with various versions also contributes to implicit preference elicitation in a manner that is, less susceptible to social desirability and other biases. So even if our context has the obvious limitations of being a survey context rather than real-life decisions, it has several advantages that I expect will come through as I present the results, including being non-invasive, and uncovering preferences from different sectors of the population. Now, let me proceed then directly to the research design, then share the results with you, and finally provide the interpretation we offer for the findings before we conclude. So in terms of the research design, let me just say a few words before I show you the figure. We conducted a survey targeting 6,000 people in Bogota, Colombia. These people were invited through Facebook, and we targeted them so that we could reach different genders, ages, and crucially, different socioeconomic groups throughout the entire city. And we were actually able to match the quotas that we set based on the most recent population census. To give you a sense of how the main component of the survey looked like, the main experimental component, I would like you to focus here on the left part. And after a basic socioeconomic characterization module, we sent 50% of the sample to conduct this kind of exercise, in which they would see an audio that they would have to play with a voice snippet in which people would describe themselves. So person one and person two would be describing themselves in first person with a positive attribute of themselves. Importantly, there was no way to move forward until you had listened to both audios. And in the description of these attributes, we based our analysis on the big 5 personality traits validated for Latin America, with a wording validated for Latin America. And this was conveyed either in a high or a low class accent. Moreover, this could be people from Bogota or from Santiago de Chile in Chile. So they could be listening to either a high or a low class accent from either a Bogotano or a Santiaguino. And with the voice, you could infer, you would have some rough idea of the age range, and you could certainly infer the sex of the person that was speaking. And then you would see the range of the income, in which we use the intervals used in Colombian censuses that are kind of representative of the levels of income in the population. We show the education level, and we show experience in 3 different levels, because it's very hard to get the actual information to kind of base our analysis from surveys. So we actually simply said, based on the age of this person, their experience is either low, medium, or high. And then finally, you would be asked to choose the person one or person two, for a variety of different tasks, okay? Now, if you want to look at the big 5, you don't know what this is. This has been super validated in psychology. These are kind of 5 basic personality traits that supposedly span the bulk of the different personalities that we have as humans. And we kind of describe them, as I said, validated in a wording validated for Latin America, and always in the positive side, in the positive spin. Everyone was presenting themselves in a positive kind of light. Now, to give you more details of how the survey flow worked, let's focus only on this part for now. After the subject socioeconomic characterization, you would have the experimental module, and then we would send 50% to the full conjoint version that I just described to you. But then we would save 40% for the leave one out variations, in which we leave some of the information out. It could be education, income, or education plus income plus experience. I should say here that even from the pilots, we found that experience had few effects. So even though we also have a variation in which we leave experience out, that's essentially done for completeness in the exercise, but overall, we found that experience had no effects. So you can think of, human capital as essentially education, experience didn't matter, and economic capital as income. And I will return to this 10% of the sample later on. Now, what can we do with this? So from this exercise, we find the average marginal component effect, which is basically what its name suggests. It's basically looking at, on average, the effect that a component, and our component of interest is having a high-class accent, has on the preferences for choosing one person versus the other in whatever outcome we are measuring, and we're going to have several outcomes in our analysis. Now, another issue that I want to emphasize is that randomizing personal income levels, education levels, or any other attributes in these sort of experiments, people sometimes just use a uniform distribution and kind of send these attributes with a uniform prior. But the problem is that that can lead to combinations of attributes that are not very realistic. And so, when I look at a non-realistic profile, I might have cognitive biases when looking at those very odd kind of people. So following De La Cuesta, Egami, and Imai, we randomized the attributes to mimic the combination that they normally have in the population. So to grasp this, for instance, it will be much more frequent to have someone with low education and low income than someone with low education and high income. Those profiles would also happen, but they only happen as frequently as they happen in real life. And this is what they call the population average marginal component effect, which they show offers greater external validity because people are not inferring from sort of odd profiles, but actually from realistic profiles. And what we're going to focus on is essentially the effect of class-based accents on choice probability, leveraging the realistic attribute distributions that we construct from kind of real-life surveys. I want to spend some time discussing some audio features. We took a number of precautions with the audios. And here are some things that I would like to highlight. So first, we avoided the class-neutral accents. First, because there is no such thing as a neutral accent. Everyone believes that they have a neutral accent, but there's no such thing as a neutral accent. But also, we actually piloted an effort to do something that was at least less obviously class salient. And what happened is that it sounded more professional in pilots, and that could have obscured kind of the class signal. So that's one conclusion from our piloting. Another thing that we did is that we minimized the repetition in listening to the same voice over and over again, which could lead to experimental demand effects. So we use kind of pitch modifying software to very subtly change the audio pitch. And also we prevented repetitive traits in pairwise comparison. So say it will be impossible to have two people that were exactly the same in every dimension, except the accent, because that it will make it very salient. Finally, the final set of kind of precautions that I want to mention are aimed to capture purely class-based variation. So that is to avoid direct signals of correlated traits, especially the ones that we are interested in, which are education and income. So there are several things here. First, the fact that we are doing this in an experimental context implies that it lacks the visible socioeconomic signals, such as body language, appearance, the way you are dressed, that would be present in kind of a real-life interaction. Second, we hired professional actors, and these voice actors, the same actor performed the high class and the low class accent. So many things about their voice were held constant, other than the instruction to follow an accent that was characteristic of the high or the low class. And in fact, and this is the third point, we managed to maintain linguistic consistency precisely because we hired actors and we instructed them against any accent traits that could imply education or income level. And this implies avoiding differences in, mispronouncing a word that is associated with a given class, or changing the word choice and things like that, that could convey the richness of your vocabulary or something that goes beyond the mere accent, but also kind of potentially conflated with income and education. Another thing is that we also avoided notable differences in speech pace and avoided common filler sounds, like well, and we normalized audio quality, including volume, because all of these helps avoid volume, speed, or anything, signaling competence, confidence, whatever else that is not simply the class that the person might belong to. Also, I mentioned, I think before, that the age of the actors is in a limited range. Everyone has similar age, so there is like no big generational shift in the terms of the accents that they are speaking. And finally, remember that we can control for the personality traits because we are including the big 5 traits in the first person. So we actually control for personality traits to make sure that this goes beyond the personality that is conveyed by a given accent. So, all of this adds up to ensure that accents are fundamentally capturing class-based variations and not other issues directly. Now, as I mentioned before, we have these leave one out variations in the experiment. And the leave one out variations allow us to look at mechanisms, which we do following Acharya, Blackwell, and Sen. And in particular, let me illustrate how this works with the case of income. So assume that I'm going to take
that. Before you go into this, one clarification question. Can you say a couple words on what was the content of the audios? So what
the content
were
of
they
the
talking
audios?
about? Yes,
they
what
are
were
essentially
they talking about?
So this is the big 5. They are essentially describing their personalities with a description that has been validated for Latin America. So here it is in English, but of course it was done in Spanish. But if it's openness, they are saying something like, I am a person with a lot of imagination and varied interests. I have many ideas, and I'm both creative and analytical. And this is kind of a psychologically tested and context-tested way to describe openness. And so on with agreeableness, conscientiousness, extraversion, and emotional stability. And all of these we described in a positive way, so that it looks like you are really evaluating two persons, and they are kind of just sharing their attributes, right? So that's essentially the content of the slide of the audience. Yeah. Okay. So thank you, Gianmarco, for allowing me to clarify that. Now, as I was saying, I'm going to try to illustrate this with the case of income. So I want you to assume for a second that I'm going to take advantage of the fact that sometimes I do not know the income of the two profiles. And that's going to lead to what we call the inferred income arm, which is that instance where I do not see the income when I choose the profiles. And if that's the case, I want you to consider the treatment of interest, which is either a high-class accent or a low-class accent, and define the difference between the proportion of times that I suggest I select the person with the high-class accent and the low-class accent as the total effect. This TE is for total effect. So, the total effect is the effect of accent when income is unknown. Now, I want you to compare that to when I observe, to the instance when I observe income. And for instance, I'm going to hold income constant here at the high level. And what that leads to is what we call the average control direct effect. So the average control direct effect is the effect of accents when income is held fixed at one level. In this case, in the illustration, high income. And finally, the difference between the total effect and the average control direct effect is what's called the eliminated effect. And this is the sum of two things. It's the sum of a causal pathway and causal interaction. So think of causal pathway as, the accent has an influence on the income, which has an influence on the outcome. But think of causal interactions as the fact that accent and income are actually not independent. They work together. So those two things are captured in the eliminated effect. And I actually cannot separate them. That is a problem in general, but it's not so much of a problem in our case, given what we're interested in, okay? Because our main purpose is going to actually establish the average control direct effect of accents while holding the potential mediators fixed. Now, perhaps at this point, a figure is helpful. Think of the class-based accents. When the eye is open is when I can see. So imagine that I can see income and education, and I am holding it fixed. That's the control direct effect. That's this upper part over here. Now, imagine when I cannot see income and education, my eyes are closed, there's a total effect, and that's the effect here with the red line. The difference between the blue and the red lines is the eliminated effect, which crucially, remember, is going to confound both the causal pathways that I emphasize here and any interactions that accents and income or accents and educations, whatever mediator we're examining, have on the outcome. Now, I know we have an audience that is mostly composed of economists, and so it is tempting to equate the blue line to taste-based discrimination and the green line to statistical discrimination. Now, we are not going to do that for several reasons. First, recent work has shown that comparing full and partial information conditions often fails to identify these two effects. And actually, that statistically has to do with the fact that we actually cannot separate the kind of causal pathways from the causal interactions. But second, perhaps more fundamentally, and this is not something that some psychologist is saying or anything, this is said by two prominent economists, our sharp distinction between statistical and taste-based discrimination is really blurred by insights from other fields. That is, we humans don't tend to operate that way when we are discriminating people. So what we're going to do actually instead is not relying on this dichotomy and trying to say that we are inferring taste-based or statistical-based discrimination. Our aim is much more focused, but we think it's very consequential, which is to test whether class-based accents affect outcomes by the role they have in signaling income and education, or whether they have direct effects. And that's going to be the first step of the results that I'll show you. The second step is, okay, if it's more than just income and education, let's interpret these independent effects using complementary outcomes. And we're going to provide complementary evidence to help interpret those results. Okay, so with those preliminary considerations, let me share with you the results. I'm going to be showing you figures similar to the one in the next slide, in which we're going to be looking at some particular outcome in each one of the panels. So for instance, in this first one, which of the two individuals seems more capable of stepping into others' shoes? And then I'm going to be focusing particularly on the effect that the high-class accent relative to the low-class accent has on that choice. And what you can see here is how there's typically a positive and quite significant, actually typically very large effect of having a high-class accent even when I'm controlling for issues such as income, education, which I'm showing you here, but also for the personality traits and the level of experience and so forth that I didn't include here just for the sake of space. And there are several interesting findings that I want to highlight here. So on the one hand, as I said, the effects are quite large. There's an increase in 6 percentage points in the belief that the person might be more able to put themselves in their own shoes. There is a bigger 14 percentage point increase in the idea that these are trustworthy people. And there's a 13 percentage increase in the desire to befriend these persons. Now, interestingly, notice that having more money, as perhaps one would expect, makes people believe that these profiles are less likely to be able to step into other people's shoes. And this is very important. It talks about the strength of culture, sorry. That is, I know that this is a high-class accent, and even though I associate it with people who belong to an elite, the culture has shown me over and over again through media in different forms that these are nice, beautiful, admirable forms of speaking. And therefore, I believe that's a sign of empathy, even though I know that richer people might be less empathic. So in a sense, culture trumps cash, at least in how people read others in our experiment on average. So money is talking, but accents sometimes speak even louder than money. Now let me move to the other key dimension, which is results in the labor market. When you look at work-related settings, we also find similar effects in the sense that there is a high-class premium. It appears for whether you prefer to do business with other people, whether you expect someone to be your boss, whether you believe that one of the individuals is more likely to receive a letter that offers a nice opportunity, that is the last column over here, whether you prefer to share a workplace. And in all, we find that there is, a high-class accent premium. And remember, this is the result for the full conjoint. So this is already controlling for income and education levels, which is the first signal that this is operating directly and not simply because accents convey the income or the education that you might have. Now, we can examine that much more directly looking at the causal mechanism analysis. So in the causal mechanism analysis, I will show you the terms that I defined before with particular emphasis on the average control direct effect, which are the triangles. And I will do this while holding income fixed at a low to middle income level or at a high income level. And what I want to show you here is that large part of the total effect is actually simply the direct effect of accent and not one that is operating through inferences about income. In some cases, it is even bigger. So this can happen. Remember that the eliminated effect is a complicated addition, or not even an addition, a complicated combination of the causal interaction with the mediating effects. So it can well be negative. But the real point that I want to stress here is that the effects of accents fixing income are positive and are large. Now, I can do that also for education. And I have changed the figure. It looks very similar, but I have actually changed it. It's still true that the average control direct effect is a large part of the total effect, sometimes even larger. You can do that also looking at income and education together. So this is more nuanced graph because I'm looking at low, high income times low, high education, health fixed. So this is the 4 combinations of low, low, high, high, low, high, high, low. But the crucial point again is that the average control direct effect is typically positive for most levels of fixed income and education, which again is focusing on the triangles in each one of these graphs. There are some exceptions, but it is by no means a thin slice that the accents are mattering in and of themselves beyond just income and education. Now, what additional insights can we get from these results? So first, let me look at heterogeneous effect by profile features. So here, what I'm showing you is how the effects vary as a function of whether you have low or high income and education in your other attributes. And what you can see here is that in general, we're finding that the high class accent premium exists for, either high income and high education, high income and low education, low income and high education, low and low. But there is a difference in the strength of these effects. And the stronger effects tend to arise not so much when you have high income and high education, for instance. That's not where the effects are biggest. An interpretation is that if both of these things are already high, perhaps the additional advantage of having a high class accent is not as big. The marginal effect of another positive attribute might not be as high. Now, conversely, When both are low, the gain is also modest. Not for all outcomes, but it's not where we see the biggest effects. So, it could be that in this case, there is a limited credibility of the high class accent. So I might not be so convinced that this person actually belongs to the high class with all the cultural and social attributes that can give you. So it might be that you need one of the two to be able to have the biggest effects. And that seems to be the case, especially when you have high income and low education. So, it's interesting that it seems that in a way, a high class accent is kind of more of a substitute for education than it is for income. A high class accent is perhaps signaling in some way that these people possess certain attributes that perhaps might make them able to make up for a not so standing education, more so than for a not so standing level of income. I should also say here that one interesting concern that we've heard in some audiences is that some people say, well, but maybe the accent is telling you the quality of education. So sure, you may have a degree in economics, but I infer it is from Universidad de los Andes if you have a high-class accent, and that's a better degree. Now, I would like to highlight here that this interpretation seems unlikely, not only given the mediation analysis for education, but also given the results here, because if this story were true, one would expect large effects of the accent with high education. It is when I have high education that the accent is telling me the quality of that high education. And that's not, particularly salient. The final of this first set of results that I want to share with you is the fact that the high class accent premium is stronger among high socioeconomic subjects. So the people that we interviewed, we test which of them are high SES. And here, what I'm showing you is the accent effect for each one of the outcomes that I mentioned before, the interpersonal ones, the labor market ones. And I'm showing you the effect of the high class accent alone, which in this case would correspond to the low SES respondents, and then the interaction with high SES. So what you can see here, if you look at the sum of these coefficients, is that low class subjects also prefer higher class accents, but it is the higher SES respondents, the ones that have the stronger preference for high class accents, sometimes even twice as big. So this is a clear signal of an in-group bias, and if they are gatekeepers, this can be a signal of persistence of inequality. There are a bunch of kind of due diligence robustness tests that we did, many of them actually that we pre-specified in our pre-analysis plan. I am not going to stop to discuss them, but if any of you is wondering about any of these issues that I'm showing you here, I'm happy to discuss them in more detail in the Q&A. Because what I would like to do now, next, and Gianmarco, this might be a good moment to take any question if there's like a common clarifying question that people are needing before I move to the interpretation of the effects.
No, just go ahead. There are no more questions for the moment.
Good, perfect. So moving to the interpretation of these effects, I would like to devote some time on what explains the accent's direct effect if it is not income or education. So one possibility is its race. Maybe the way that we are transmitting this accent is signaling race. This is very unlikely by design because the type of intonation variations, the type of accent variations that we used and that we instructed the actors to use signal high or low class accents in a way that is actually quite cross-race. They are not really correlated with a given race. Moreover, in Bogota, this is not true for all of Colombia, but in Bogota, the correlation between, this is average color of skin and this is household income. If the correlation in Colombia between these two things is indeed negative and it's, negative 13, in Bogota is actually less than half. So we don't think that it could be the entire story. By design, it isn't, the context doesn't make it very likely. Another possibility is that it's wealth. So yeah, we shared income, but we didn't share wealth. Maybe they are inferring wealth, and that's important. Now here, in that case, we actually see an even closer correlation between income and wealth. I mean, by sharing income, we are sharing wealth. So this is very unlikely to be driving the full set of results that we are seeing here. If that's the case, then someone could say, well, maybe it's other desirable attributes. We again think this is unlikely the full story because we have a very careful accent manipulation that I took some time to describe for precisely this reason. And second, whatever desirable attribute it is, it would need not to cross borders for reasons that I'm going to explain later when I share the migration results. So if this is the case, then what is our interpretation? Well, what we argue is that it is really because they are transmitting what we refer to as immaterial social assets, which is the combination of social and cultural assets. That is social capital in the form of signaling that these people are likely to have a value derived from having a network of relationship with others, and cultural assets in the sense that they share the forms of knowledge, skills, learned behaviors, preferences that give a person the greater status and the sense of belonging to that certain group. And this is kind of the social cultural capital, which has been amply studied by sociology. Now, some evidence that is consistent with this interpretation is the fact that we wanted to make sure that our actors were doing a good job. So we ran a social class classification task in the pilot, and we asked people to predict the social class based on just the voice. And you can see that the actors did a good job. So the first column shows that our actors are able to increase with their high class pitch or accent more than 20 percentage points in the probability of considering the profile high class, all else held constant. But then we ask people to predict the sport, leisurely activities, and musical preferences, giving them some that are typical of the high classes versus some that are typical of the low classes. And again, we typically find along all these dimensions that the high class accent is associated with a higher class activities and preferences. And finally, in this last column, we asked them to predict whether they believed that the profiles had friends that were socially influential. And you see that there's a strong effect there. So this is all consistent with the fact that what they are inferring with the high class accent is not only belonging to a social class and simply sharing the income and education of that class, but also sharing the cultural outlook and the extent of social networks that these profiles might have. Now, also, to reinforce the role that language plays in signaling these issues, we ran one variation. Remember that I mentioned that one of the outcomes was whether I would get a job, and that was signaled through a letter that was meant for one of the profiles, and the subjects had to choose who is this letter aimed at, who is going to receive this letter with this good job offer. And sometimes that letter was written in a deferential language, and sometimes it was written, informally in a non-deferential language. And what you can see here is that the average effect of the high class accent on the probability of receiving that letter actually is heterogeneous when you look at whether that letter was written non-deferential or deferential. That is, when the letter is written deferentially, you as a subject are more likely to think, oh, this is meant to be for the person who has the high class accent, who I should address deferentially. So this is just a complementary exercise to show another indication that class is very intimately related with language and how we use language. The, almost final penultimate result that I want to share with you is we did another exercise, which exploits what I mentioned before, which is that we had some Santiaguino accents, some accents from Santiago de Chile. All that I shared before were people from Bogotá ranking people from Bogotá, Bogotanos ranking Bogotanos. But Bogotanos also rank Santiaguinos. So the first thing that I want to show you here in the upper panel is that when I make people from Santiago classify high class accents from Santiago, it works. The Chilean actors did a good job. It predicts class, it predicts sports, leisurely activities, and musical activities typical of the high classes, and also social influence. However, when Bogotanos are classifying Santiaguinos in the lower panel, we are unable to infer the social class of people with a high class accent from Santiago, and that is going to be a key finding. The second key finding is that the high class premium becomes much smaller and typically is not significantly different from zero when Bogotanos rank Santiaguino profiles. So in these outcomes, again, all the set of outcomes that we are analyzing, you have to add the first coefficient, which is the effect for a high class accent, with the interaction of that high class accent with being a Chilean high class accent. And you can see that the sum of these two terms are typically small, and they are often actually not significantly different from zero. So there are two key takeaways from this one. The first one is for the migration literature. The migration literature tends to emphasize that migration is a costly cultural enterprise, and it is. But this result that I'm showing you also shows that a low-class person from certain origin countries can at least have the blessing that in everyday interactions with others, they might not infer their social class right away and discriminate with accents. Of course, high-class migrants also need to convey their advantage in ways other than accents in foreign settings. But this tells us about a cost of adaptation that in some cases is actually a benefit of adaptation that has not, to our knowledge, been much emphasized. That's one kind of message for the migration literature and like examining how this travels across cultures. But for our exercise, this is also important because if it were the case that privileged people somehow universally show through their voices some confidence on some other trait common among the people who have been in the higher class, then one would have expected a premium here. And the fact that it is absent reinforces our interpretation that this depends on a culturally coded signal of belonging to a given social group with its connections and with its learned behaviors that provide advantage. Okay. For the final exercise that I want to share, let me return for a second to the experimental design. And what I want to show you is that we sent 50% of the people to the full conjoined, 40% of the people to the leave one out versions, but then we reserved 10% of the people to a version that had no voice whatsoever. All the information was transmitted through texts. They kind of performed a similar exercise, but they weren't listening to voices. What's the motivation? The motivation is to explore whether the modules in which they actually had to listen to the audios, by listening to those voices, subjects are primed by making class-based accents salient that they live in an unequal and segregated society where these cultural gaps exist between social groups. And we can compare them to those who didn't listen to any voices and see if there's an effect. Now, I should say from the start that we knew from the start that this was a very subtle treatment and that it might not have very strong effects. So take that for what it is. And in general, we indeed find few effects, except for something that was actually pre-specified, which is an increase in an index of familism, which we define as the difference between trusting people who are close to me and trusting people who are distant from me. So essentially, the theory here is that by making people more aware of these differences, in-groups and out-groups are more salient, and people move inward in their trust expectations. However, we didn't find any effects for whether they become more or less generous, whether they trust more or less the institutions of the country, whether they become more or less optimistic, whether they believe more or less in meritocracy, or whether they think that inequality is more or less of a problem in society. So I'm getting to the wrap up. So in short, I have shown that there's a high-class accent premium in interpersonal and labor market scenarios, that this is associated with in-group bias because this premium is larger among high socioeconomic status subjects, that this is a direct effect in the sense that it goes beyond the impact via income and education. I also show that this class-based premium fades for foreigners, which is significant for migration and for our interpretation. And finally, we find some effects on trust in strangers versus close connection. We conclude, therefore, that accents are capital. They significantly influence social and economic access and are not only the results of these differences. And I think just to provoke in the Q&A, this leads us to a very interesting discussion because it is a challenging form of discrimination. It appears in frequent interactions. It is hard to conceal. It may operate subconsciously most of the time. And it becomes very relevant for many policy debates because, if some of what reinforces inequality is not having different access to resources like education or income, but actually these cultural issues, then we have to start thinking about how is it that we can attenuate the effect of these cultural barriers. Of course, if we could remove segregation, that would be it. But maybe without that, we can think of enhancing contact, changing the way we represent things in media, making efforts in public communication, maybe specific policies towards debiasing. And I'm sure that this is something that we don't have it figured out. We just want to provoke the discussion. And it's just one of the reasons why these results we believe are relevant. So I think I'll stop there, and I'm 45-minute mark. So I hope this is okay in terms of the time managing.
Fantastic. I think that you've been the best time manager in the seminar so far, finishing
Okay,
at
good.
45 exactly. So if you have any questions, please just raise your virtual hand and I'll open the mic for you. So let me just open up the discussion while people. Francisco had a question and he just raised his hand. So let me open the mic for you. Francisco, I was just going to read the question that you were putting on the chat. So better if you read it, you ask it directly.
Thanks, Gianmarco. Leo, can you hear me?
Perfect.
Great. Thanks a lot. Really, really nice talk. Really nice idea. I'm just curious about understanding a little bit more of the treatment. I just want to understand exactly like what people understood from the audios. Like if I understand correctly, so it's the very same text. It's not a text particular to like talking about the job or anything. It's just the description of the big five. So maybe this was not a text intended to like emphasize like differences in accents, right? So just understand like what people understood from the audios, and the other thing I was writing on the chat, like if you found any heterogeneous effects by gender, both gender of the actors, if you had any differences, and also respondents.
Thank you, Francisco. So in terms of the first question, yes, so exactly that. So this is not something in which they are obviously talking about something that directly relates to their accents. We didn't want to make this salient precisely to avoid social desirability bias. Class-based accents in Colombia for every major city are a recognizable thing, so much so that there are, comedians making fun of these accents. And if you made it so obvious, people would be defensive and say, like, I am not going to discriminate this guy just because he's speaking Ñero, which is the low-class accent in Bogota. Or, oh, they are showing me a high-class accent. This guy is a high-class person. They are trying to test me whether I actually am a classist person. I prefer to hang out with high-class people. I'm not going to be that person. So we actually were worried about that, and this is one of the great advantages of the survey, that this is not saliently about accent. This is what happens. This is some kind of speech that you would listen to in everyday conversations if you go outside during the day out of your home in Bogota. So in that sense, that perhaps explains why we have kind of limited downstream effects, but it also explains why we can be trustful of the effects not having a social desirability bias. And I should say that we ran a social desirability scale and tested robustness on a social desirability scale, and all the results go through even for people who are kind of sensitive to social desirability. So that was exactly the reason why we designed it this way. And it would be natural that people, when they present themselves, speak of themselves in a positive light. So that's kind of the motivation for that. Then your second question was with regards with heterogeneous effects for gender, both of a speaker and subject. We did test for that. I think, if I don't remember incorrectly, but maybe my co-authors can help me out if my recollection is false, that there was less discrimination against women than against men. That is, if the profile had a high versus low, this effect is bigger for men than for women. I don't remember for the subjects, however. But we can double check, and if Michael and Natalia want to complement my memory on this, you're welcome to do it.
My recollection was similar, Leopoldo, although
Okay.
we focus heterogeneous treatment effects analyses obviously on socioeconomic status much more than on gender.
Exactly.
Great, thanks. Suana?
Thank you. I just had a question about how some accents have come to be considered high class in Colombia.
Yeah. Well, that's really a historical process in every society. You tend to go to the same places, attend the same schools, see the same sort of people. And so you adopt manners of speech and you learn it subconsciously, and they become a signal of belonging to that class. And I think that's true for many, many, many societies. It is also true that it's not something that is fixed in time. So if you look at what the high class accent was in Bogota 30 or 40 or 50 years ago, it was probably similar to the high class accent in Ecuador, but it was very different to the high class accent that we have today. And the one that I have today is subtly different, but perhaps more similar to the one that we had 20 years ago and so forth. Because one interesting thing about this is I mentioned, maybe we can think about what we can do actively about this. How can we, for instance, change the representation in media? And one key example that comes to mind here is the BBC. The BBC used to only present British pronunciation in its broadcasts. And they realized, oh, we are kind of reinforcing the idea that this is the high class accent that historically was created as the one that is supposed to be the high status one. Let's also show people from regional accents, from working class accents, and let's show them in a positive light so that people don't necessarily associate that this accent is associated with the positive, the good, and the beautiful. But even if we do not we don't do active things like that, society is changing so all the time. So I mentioned before that there are comedians making fun of the current high class accent in Bogota. And of course, that will probably lead to high class kids growing up to say like, oh, it's not so cool to have that high class accent. And my guess is that's not going to banish the high class accent. It might mute it, but it will morph into something new that people who belong to the group are especially able to recognize. And even people who do not belong to the group, if society is sufficiently differentiated and equal and kind of show this accent in a positive light in media and so on, are also going to have these positive perceptions of. But it's really kind of a dynamic and complex historical process that leads to these different accents and being recognized. And I mentioned the example with high-class accent, but with low-class accents, we also see people who say, like, why do you think that Ñero is bad? I actually want to vindicate Ñero. And there are cultural wars being fought here in saying, like, Ñero is actually a cool thing to be. So, you know, this is not static, it's not simple, and this is just the average effect. People on average prefer the high-class accent, but it might not be the same in other contexts and in other situations.
Thank you.
Nice. I had one question. I was wondering if you can somehow get at the extent to which people misperceive the value of the social connections that are associated with high class accents. No, for example, if you look at the heterogeneity of your effects on whether one person will get a job or not by work experience, right? So probably if you have work experience, you have better information of how valuable the network of the person with the high versus low accent is. That may help you to pin down a little bit more the social capital context.
That's interesting. So you're saying that the work experience is a proxy for the contacts that I might have, and we could actually kind of bet
the work experience of the person, of the subject, of the person who listens to the audio is a proxy of how much information I have about how the labor market works, and among those things is how valuable is the network of the high class accent.
Okay, that's a good idea. So you are expecting that people who have more work experience, if it's actually not true that being a high class person gives you a lot of connections, are not going to be so convinced just with the voice that these people have influential friends.
Exactly.
Because they know they have seen through life. I mean, it could go either way. They either have seen through life that actually it matters a lot, or they have seen through life that it doesn't matter that much,
yes.
And they will update. So that's cool. We can certainly do that, and that's a good idea. Let us do that. We haven't done it. But your comment also makes me think of the other possibility, which is like we have work experience, and we can see heterogeneity by work experience of the profile. The work experience of the profile can be a proxy for how many contacts they have. And we can see, like, benchmark that effect relative to the effect that only the accent has. And that could be a neat comparison, just in terms of magnitude. So yeah, cool
Yeah,
ideas.
no, that would be really cool. I mean, I got to think about this from your last comments in terms of policy implications, and it brought to mind the Bernstein and Yanagisawa Trott paper on Saudi Arabia, right? To what extent we have perceptions that persist in time, and when actually people realize that their previously ingrained perceptions are not true, you realize that you lower your expected value of a certain feature. No, in their case, gender; in your case, accent.
Right.
But
Interesting. Yeah, that's cool. Yeah, I don't know the extent of pluralistic ignorance here, but it would be nice to see if people who are more informed have different views. So super interesting.
Giacomo?
I think Nikos was first, but
No, it's okay. Well, I'll ask afterwards. We also have an attendee
you're
question.
closer to okay. Hey, thanks so much. This is fascinating. I was wondering, sometimes there's this difference between dialects, accents, and common shared language. So,
Yeah.
to what extent, essentially, the accent would signal a different language, jargon, way of speaking? So, what is the difference along these dimensions? How far are they from reaching out to a wider population? So is dialect essentially a correlate of speaking a different type of dialect / jargon, or is literally just, this is just it's just an accent? I mean, you essentially use the same words in everything you speak, but it's just you pronounce them slightly differently.
Yeah. So look, you are completely right to think that in real life, word choice, jargon plays an important role. So part of the impulse that authors had when we first gave them the script to sound high class or low class was to choose the precise words that were distinctively high class or distinctively low class. So if we were aiming for total realism, that's what we should have done. The problem with that is that confounds education directly, because the richness of your vocabulary is education. I think that in our kind of a positive thing for us is that these are short audio snippets. So it is believable that you were to say that entire sentence with exactly the same words as someone with a higher class, and not having chosen within that 30, not even 30, these are 15-second snippets.
Yeah.
Not having to use one of the jargons. But you're completely right. So we aimed for a clean treatment here, even though the other thing was realistic, because the more realistic thing would lead us astray in terms of the unbundling that we want to do.
But one way I'm thinking about this, like, think about, the Spanish dialects, right? Some of them are very far from each other, which basically means that a common shared language would be the only way to really have a larger trading network. So here, this is a somewhat, on top of the fact that you've chosen specific words. I mean, people might have inferred different things, like listeners infer different things. So the accent to me is, not just low class, high class, but it's also, how easy it's going to be for the general population to deal with this. And that's the reason why, many Latin language station and TV and so on went to a common, very, bland sort of way of speaking, which could be high class typically. But
Right. Yeah, I think you are right. I think the context also helps us here a lot, in the sense that the distance, I mean, this is, in our case, it will be just jargon. So two words that are completely acceptable in Spanish, but the higher class chooses one more often than the other, even they might use both of them. It's that kind of thing. It's not really differences in that go beyond a word choice for a certain phenomenon. So I think that what you're saying kind of emphasizes that we have to be very clear about the context here. There are not at all any large dialectic variations here across the classes beyond subtle word choices that may or may not appear in a 15-second speech. But I completely agree with you that there are contexts where actually even 15 seconds without appealing to this dialect implies that you are conveying something else. like, come on, man, you are speaking, you are not showing who you are by speaking that way. I think in our case we're safe, but I completely agree with you that that's not a general statement.
Fantastic. Thank you.
No, thanks to you.
We have just 1 minute. Mateo, if you have a question and you can make it really short, that would be appreciated.
Okay, I'm gonna try. So thanks, Leopoldo. So implicitly, I think like throughout your talk, what I could tell is that you're thinking of accents as something that is fixed, that sort of is predetermined. But we tend to think, you know, and I can think of many cases in which like people are consciously changing their accent in one way or another. And given the source of your variation, these conjoint experiments, I feel like the most of the variation you're getting is when people are surprised, right? When maybe the accent doesn't correspond quite to the income and so on. And so maybe in those cases, what you're telling is precisely that people are changing their accents in a way that precisely mimics, I think, like your results. They're trying to be more pro-social, to be perceived as more congenial, as trying to do efforts. So what I want to know your thoughts about this line of thought.
Yeah, I guess if that were the case, then I would have expected bigger effects also when you have low income or when you have low both, and you are surprised and say, oh, this person might be low income and low education, but they are actually among those people who make an effort to speak nicely, and therefore I'm going to give them a bigger premium. And precisely with the figure that I'm showing you here, that's not really what happens. So that in terms of the results, like it might be that I'm inferring part of the result might be I'm inferring the competence of a person to be able to learn the nice way of speaking according to society's, dominant kind of views. I cannot completely rule that out, but it doesn't seem to me, given these results, that the surprise factor is actually what is flying in the face of these heterogeneous effects. Now, your question is super interesting because you're completely right that in my presentation here, I talked as if this was fixed, and it is not entirely fixed, but it is very hard to change. Some people can do it and some people can just not do it. And you grow up with a bunch of people who speak this way, and you can moderate it perhaps to some extent. You cannot completely hide it, and there are some people who can just simply not hide it at all. And in fact, some people who could hide it, if they make an effort, don't want to, because you have this trade-off between the sense of belonging to a community that I emerged from and this other thing that perhaps is valued in the job market or in interpersonal relations. And you have many examples of that. One that I love to mention is Daniel Murcia Guzman, this low-class person who became rich with a pyramid scheme in Colombia. He did all sorts of things to fit into the elite. So he wanted to, eat properly, say hello properly, say goodbye properly, dress properly. But there were a few things that he wouldn't give away. Like, for instance, his hairstyle, which was clearly low class, he wouldn't give it away because it was an aspect of his identity. So the deeper issue that you are referring to in the question also says why this is kind of a complicated issue to tackle, because it's not that the policy prescription from this can be, well, try to teach everyone to speak nicely so that they are not disadvantaged. That would be kind of a complicated thing to even implement, and sometimes would be kind of met with resistance on identity grounds. But I think it's a super interesting discussion.
Fantastic. So I think that this gives me some self-justification for why I still keep my strong Latino accent. All right, so let's just leave it there. We'll reconvene in a couple of weeks with Pauline Rossi from the École Polytechnique, who will be talking about the long-run impact of forced labor migration on fertility. And thank you very much, Leopoldo, Natalia, and Michael for a fantastic presentation, and congrats on a great paper. The link to Leopoldo's Zoom room is on the chat. Just give him a couple of minutes to go to the restroom, get some water, and he can meet you over there. All right. Thank you very much, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you. It was great. Thank you so much.